Welcome to A Little Bit Radical, a business podcast from Standing on Giants. I'm Rob, your host. Join me as I meet people and organisations who are doing things differently, challenging the status quo and, yes, might just be a little bit radical. If you're a regular listener to this podcast, then you will have heard us talk about B Corp a lot. Over half of our guests have been leaders of B Corps, businesses that are committed to prioritising people and planet as well as turning a profit. With so much talk about B Corps, we thought it was high time we get B Lab themselves on the podcast. James Ghaffari joins us today. James is Director of Growth and Product at B Lab UK, the non-profit behind the B Corp certification. The UK community is now nearing 2,000 businesses, with a total of 8,000 around the world. Let's get into it. James, welcome to the podcast.
Absolutely delighted to be here. Thanks, Rob, and looking forward to getting into all things B Corp.
Fantastic. So, James, if you are a little bit radical and you're on our podcast, so we know that you are, what in your early life set you up for that?
It's probably quite like a lot of the other people that you may have had on your podcast before. I've been really privileged to do a lot of traveling in my time, and I've got to go and see a lot of different cultures and a lot of kind of different societies. And in doing so, you also get to see a lot of the kind of inequality between countries and the kind of differences in people's experiences of the world. I think that obviously played a huge part. Likewise, from a kind of an academic point of view, I studied in university not only about philosophy and ethics and what it means to live your life in a good and meaningful way, but also about kind of politics and economics and how they play out differently across the globe, and how our interdependent global system creates winners and also creates losers. And I think that plays a huge part as well. But I guess if I could go back even further than that, this kind of curiosity for exploring other worlds, other viewpoints, was actually set and trained by my parents, and how much they instilled in me a love of reading. In fact, my family home is kind of like a library. So I was really privileged to be able to have access to that. And I think really that helped me kind of look for the whole story and not only see the world through one lens, the one that by my own upbringing I have access to.
Really interesting, James. I'm reminded of one of my favourite books, Freakonomics, where they showed the correlation between the number of books in a home and the ultimate economic outcomes of children. Not a causal relationship per se, but it's indicative of a combination of things. You mentioned privilege, and you've mentioned education and curiosity, and parents taking in, an interest in being able to be active. I think that's really fascinating. I'd like to go back to your travels. Is there one particular country you visited or experience you had that you remember really kind of shaking you and sort of waking you up to something you'd not been aware of before, or at least not seen with your own eyes before?
Yeah, I mean, I guess one of my first kind of experiences of kind of long-term traveling was going to East Africa when I was in my late teens. I spent about 3 months there and made a lot of friends there, and also was able to see how much kind of hard work and determination people there had to kind of improve their own lives. But that was set against a context of a lack of a social safety net. And so that really kind of helped me understand what we have in this country, or what I have in this country in my position, upon which we can kind of build all of our kind of determination and our passion and our hard work, whereas other people are starting from a lower base without a safety net and have as much, if not more, of that hard work and determination, but do not have as much to show for it, essentially.
Really good. Thank you for sharing that. So, as an adult, do you think you've become more or less radical, and what's been behind that?
In some ways more, and in some ways less. As I've got older, I've got more impatient with the pace of change and how quickly we need to respond to some of the global challenges confronting us. This is highlighted, I think, when you have kids. I've just had my first.
Congratulations.
Thank you. You realise that they're going to experience the worst effects of these challenges, climate crisis, rather than them happening to some people way off in the future that you don't necessarily feel an affinity to. I suppose also less radical, as I have probably more experience of how change happens and how you have to bring people along with you and engage with others that might disagree with what you're doing. And this dialogue, this engagement always has the potential to kind of compromise how radical you can be if you ultimately want to get things done.
That is, I think, the nub of something really important as we go into the rest of the conversation. I mean, I call it, I suppose, pragmatism often. Personally, I've reflected that as I've got older, I still kind of have the same ideals, have the same ideology. Like in my ideal world, we would still have no monarchy, for example. But then the pragmatist in me, realizes that's not something that most people want, actually. And it's also probably not the most practical thing that we can do to make change now. Don't come at me, monarchists, by the way. As I say, it was an example, not my number one issue. But is that kind of what you mean, that there has to be a kind of a pragmatic element to making change? And so it just can't be as fast and as radical as you might like?
Absolutely. And, I struggle with that as well, that kind of feeling that you've just articulated, because sometimes I kind of think, well, when we're talking about radical, we're also talking about realism. Like if you look at something like the climate crisis and you look at what would be a science-aligned goal and a climate justice-aligned goal for a developed nation like the UK to meet net zero, it would be something like 2025, 2027. That's never going to happen. And so it sounds radical for you to say, but it's actually realism. It's actually based in the science. And so there is this kind of real interplay between what is radical and what is realistic and aligned with science that's kind of playing out in the climate crisis. But that is always kind of being checked by what you kind of articulated there, which is in order for change to happen, and how we've seen kind of major changes throughout history, it's not necessarily that you have to engage with, the 10% on the other end of the spectrum that are diametrically opposed to your belief, but you do have to start to engage the next 10% along that are closest to you, and then the next 10% and the next 10%, the next 10%. And that does mean that you have to compromise, you have to change the way in which you're talking to people, you have to meet people where they're at. So yes, I do struggle with it too, but there is that element of kind of compromise if you want to see change really happen.
I think it's a good opportunity to move into the work section of our conversation now and start talking about B Corp, because meeting people where they're at, it's a great place to meet people in the snack bar that they buy, or the drink that they drink, or the digital marketing agency that they hire as part of their job, and so I love B Corp as a kind of embodiment of this principle, really. There might be some people who don't know about B Corp at all, haven't heard about it. This is the first time they're hearing about it. So introduce us to B Lab and B Corp and what it means, and your involvement with them over the years.
Absolutely, yeah. So B Corps are essentially companies all across the globe that are using business as a force for good. And they do that in two key ways. They meet high standards of social and environmental performance, and they do that through our kind of online B Impact assessment. But they also crucially change the governance of their business. They make a legal change to say that they will consider the impact of all of their decisions as a business on all of their stakeholders, rather than just their shareholders. And this is illustrative really of what the wider B Corp movement is there to do. It is there to certify companies, to make each individual companies meet higher standards of social and environmental performance. But above and beyond that, it is about fundamentally changing the way in which business is done. And every B Corp that joins in any sector, in any region, in any nation in the world is contributing to that global movement to change the role of business in people's lives, and actually to help businesses tackle some of those social and environmental challenges that we are faced with right now, rather than contributing to them.
This might seem like a bit of a stupid question, James, but what do we mean by stakeholder? I think it's a word that's being thrown around a lot now and is at risk of kind of a lot of people really not knowing what they mean by stakeholder. So when you run a business for the stakeholders, what does that mean?
It's a really good point. Thanks for asking clarification on that, because when I talk about these topics, I'm really keen not to alienate people or not to kind of hit them with a bunch of jargon or acronym soup, because I think that turns people off. When they think about ESG, CSR, all of these different terms, it could be really challenging for people to engage with. But I think stakeholders is a really useful one for us to kind of hang on to. So stakeholders is essentially any group that is affected by or affects the business. So that could be your customers, it could be your employees, it could be your suppliers, it could be yes, your shareholders, and then also it could be the communities in which you operate, the society in which you operate, and also, ultimately, it is also the planet. And so by actually holding on to this term of stakeholders and thinking about your business based on its impact on all of those stakeholders, you can not only address some of the kind of negative effects that business in the past has had on, say, society and had on the environment, as well as their workers as well, but also you are just there to improve your relationship with those stakeholders. And given that they are a fundamental part of your business, that can only really spell long-term prosperity for the business, because you're having a better relationship with your people who work for you. You're having a better relationship with your suppliers or your consumers. And ultimately, you're having a positive impact on the communities in which you operate and having a positive impact on the planet.
Can you paint a picture for us of why, in your view, we need this change? Perhaps in painting the picture of the opposite end of the spectrum, a pure kind of shareholder interest company and what impact that creates versus a B Corp model business.
Obviously, the existing orthodoxy in business practice is this idea of shareholder privacy, which, to unpack, is just that the directors of the business have to make decisions on what is best for just the shareholders and drive the value of the company based on returning profits to shareholders. Obviously, there are unintended consequences of that. And I use that phrase unintended, a little bit, I hold that lightly. But ultimately, it means that you can essentially do anything to your people, to the communities in which you operate, to the planet, as long as you're returning the maximum amount of value to those shareholders. So not only does this lead to exploitative practices for those other stakeholders that don't happen to be the shareholders of the company, but it also drives short-term thinking, because it kind of focuses the mind on, in this quarter, in this year, how much can we return to shareholders so that they're happy, so that we've met what's called our fiduciary duty as a director, rather than how can we think more widely about this business and how it sits in the community, how it sits on a planet, and think about the interplay between us as a business, our shareholders, but also the people that work for us, the society that we operate in, and the planet, and think about actually how can we drive the longer term prosperity of that. And I think taking this kind of stakeholder value-led lens rather than a shareholder value-led lens allows you to do that, think more widely about the business, situate it in a community, on a planet, and actually drive prosperity for the long term rather than the short term.
Really good. I always think about cutting down the Amazon to farm cattle to make burgers when I think about this. I think that is probably the most perfect example of a decision that for the shareholders makes great sense. Let's chop down this free forest, graze some cattle on it, make some cheap burgers, which we then sell in the West, at an inflated margin, and our profits go up, but we're chopping down the lungs of the earth. Very obvious one, but I always think about that one. Let's get back to being a B Corp and B Lab now. Take us through when you joined B Lab and how it's changed. When did you join and what's happened since?
So I joined 5 years ago and things have changed enormously. We probably had about 150 B Corps back then, and now we're about to hit 2,000 here in the UK, and actually we're the fastest growing B Corp market in the world.
Which is head of growth. You must be pretty pleased about that.
I always say, I think it's correlation, not causation. I'm not going to own just that one. But ultimately, it's not actually just about the numbers though. It is about the impact. It's about all of those people that work for those companies who are thinking more deeply now about their workforce. It's all of the kind of new stories that you hear about innovative business models or innovative manufacturing processes across different industries that are designed to conserve water or conserve energy or to reduce waste. That's really what I think has been really inspiring to see and what I'm passionate about. And I guess also what is exciting is I no longer have to explain what I do to my friends as I did 5 years ago. They actually now get it because they've seen the logo on a pack, or they've seen it on a tube advert, or actually seen it on a TV advert. There's a bunch of TV adverts now as well, which is great. Even a gift gaff, which I know you have a relationship with, which is really exciting.
That's right. Yeah, that was a nice moment for us. So for those who don't know, our founders at Standing on Giants met on the startup team at giffgaff. I mean, let's hear about some of these companies. Do you have some favorites? I know that, you've just become a real parent. I know you're like a parent to the B Corp community as well, but give us some of the ones that are really special to you.
I was going to say it's like choosing your favorite child, but I only have one child, so I only have one. I can have a favorite now, so that's fine. But it is tricky. I love them all equally, but I probably wouldn't say or raise up as an example Tony's Chocolonely.
Delicious.
Because it's delicious, but also the way it's kind of entered the market and how mission driven it is at the core of its business. So if people don't know, Tony's Chocolonely is a chocolate brand that is fundamentally committed to eradicating inequality and exploitation in the chocolate industry. And they create a lot of transparency around how they're doing that and how they're doing that in their own backyard, but also trying to change the industry as a whole. So I think Tony's Chocolonely is a really great example, and actually a great example of a company that is kind of innovating with its own governance. I'm talking about governance because actually at its core, governance is what the B Corp movement is about. As we've talked about previously, it is about shifting from this shareholder value-based governance system to a stakeholder value-based governance system. So hopefully the more I can talk about governance, the sexier it'll seem.
We can but hope, James.
I know,
I appreciate your commitment to it, yeah.
That's a big dream. So Tony's Chocolonely have actually introduced a golden share mechanism, which prevents shareholders from weakening its sustainability commitments in the future. So these shares, these golden shares, are safeguarded by independent mission guardians who essentially have veto power to prevent legal changes to its sourcing principles and also to its mission, as I said before, to eradicate inequality and exploitation in the chocolate industry. It's really exciting to see companies that are innovating with their governance model. They're not just taking business orthodoxy and running with it. They're not even just going to become a B Corp, as Tony's Chocolonely have done, but they're going another step forward to innovate around their governance and create ideas that can hold them to their mission throughout growth and throughout their kind of lifetime. There's another great example actually of how they've done this. Any stakeholder, we talked about stakeholders as well, so employees, cocoa farmers, business partners, consumers, can actually anonymously raise concerns with these guardians. And then those guardians have the power to work with senior management to resolve these concerns. But if that fails, they can actually then publish their concerns in the annual report of the company or in full-page newspaper adverts. So they can go as far as referring the matter for legal investigation and arbitration. So it's these kind of new governance models that are really exciting to see companies experiment with.
That is amazing. I can see why you picked out them. They're so great. They gave me a dilemma. I'm a vegan, quite a passionate one. So obviously I care deeply about avoiding the exploitation of animals. So eat dark chocolate without milk. But then I met Tony's Chocolonely, who were like, well, actually, there's a lot of exploitation of humans in the production of chocolate. And I'm like, great, what do I pick now? So luckily, Tony's have started making a vegan bar, so I've got the best of both worlds.
Exactly. Yeah, that was a lifesaver when that came along.
Yeah, exactly. You remind me, James, of Blair Glencorse we had on the podcast, who is head of Accountability Lab, an NGO. And he said that if you see inequality, the root cause of it really is poor governance, lack of accountability, lack of leadership. You know, if you see a community that has no school, it's because a leader has decided not to build a school. It's not because of any other reason, really. And that kind of really resonates, I think, with what you're saying about the governance of businesses. Ultimately, if you see poor business practices, it's because there's leader or group of leaders with poor accountability, or, as you say, accountability to the wrong group, just accountability to shareholders and to maximize profit. I got a bit enraged personally on LinkedIn, as I often do. Those of you listening might often get enraged by going on LinkedIn. But I saw someone refer to B Corp as greenwashing. I think you must get this a lot. So I could say what I think about that, but I'd like to hear from you what you think about. You've probably had a few more greenwashing labels than I have. So what do you think about that statement? What would you say to that person?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that transparency is a kind of fundamental tenet of B Corps and what they sign up to. So, for example, companies have to display their score on the B impact assessment. They also have disclosures of sensitive issues that they have to make publicly, and sometimes even have to have their entire assessment public on their B Corp profile. And so actually, by becoming a B Corp, companies are putting themselves out there to say, we want to be better, and here's what we have done. So I actually think we should champion that level of ambition. But that also does mean that where companies don't meet those ambitions, we should also point that out. That's why we have clear complaints mechanisms to identify companies behaving in that way and behaving in a way that's contradictory to B Corp values. I think it's important to note like B Corps are not perfect, but they're all on a journey of continuous improvement. And so we talked about B Corp as a certification, but ultimately we are trying to build a movement of companies to systematically change the way in which business is done in this country. And for that to happen, we need enough businesses inside the tent so that policymakers can't ignore us.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd go with that. Thank you for that answer. My simple answer to this particular person was, well, I can tell you've never gone through the B Corp assessment if you think that it's greenwashing, because there's much easier ways to greenwash than going through the sometimes arduous and painful process of B Corp certification. So yeah, and it's also, this is I'm sure, a bit of a communications challenge for you. It's not just an environmental accreditation. It looks at all areas of your business. This is a good opportunity for us to talk about the new standards that B Corp are introducing. Tell us about that. So how businesses have been scored in the past and how they're going to be scored in the future and what's been behind that decision and that process.
And as you say, it's probably best to kind of start with where we are right now. So our current standards are based on a kind of a flexible approach that's linked to achieving an 80-point score on the B impact assessment across a range of practices and attributes that relate to a company's positive impact. So as you say, like their environmental impact, their engagements in their supply chain, their work with customers, their work with their employees. So there's a lot of different areas that companies can talk about their positive impact. And ultimately, the minimum requirement is to score 80 points across all of those areas, and it can be made up in different ways. That approach has been tremendously valuable and impactful in the kind of 17 years since B Corp was first launched in the US. But ultimately, as the climate crisis intensifies, as social inequality grows, we need to kind of think again about how we bring about systemic change. And we actually develop our standards as a matter of course. And so we're actually on version 6 of the assessment. And then we are going now into probably the biggest evolution of our performance standards to date. But ultimately, to transform the economic system, we have to transform ourselves and actually look at what businesses must do now to show leadership and meet the magnitude of the challenge ahead. And that really has been why we've started this process of creating new standards. And we've been through 2 public consultations now to engage the kind of key stakeholders in what these minimum requirements should look like. So we are moving away now from this 80-point bar to actually a set of minimum requirements that companies must meet across 9 key impact topics. These new performance requirements mean that B Corp's impact must be comprehensive and across all of their operations. And also it means that we can set the bar externally about what a good business should look like. So that means excellence across the board and not just in one area. So to give you an idea of those 9 impact topics, it's across things like purpose and stakeholder governance. We've talked a lot about that. Workplace culture, fair wages, human rights, climate action, environmental stewardship and circularity, justice, equity, diversity and inclusion, and collective action. So an extremely broad array of topics, and businesses are going to have to meet minimum performance requirements across all of those.
I think you'd be hard pushed to find anyone who conceptually disagrees with that. But we're coming up against our old friend, the ideal versus the pragmatism, because I know that there's going to be some challenges with these new standards in particular industries. I know that hospitality, particularly, in the fair wages section, they will say we can't viably pay everyone the national living wage. We hire a lot of teenagers part-time, we can't pay them the national living wage, etc. How are you negotiating those kind of challenges? Are you going to come to a point where there might be some B Corps who fall short of the new standards and have to leave the community?
It is something that we have to think about deeply and kind of calibrate. There is room for that calibration in the new standards. So there will be minimum requirements that hold for different levels, different sizes of companies, and sometimes in different markets, because we have to think about equity in these standards. That some companies in different countries are not able to meet some of these requirements. And also across different sectors, there will be kind of a bit of tailoring. But ultimately, if we think about B Corp as a certification, everything seems quite black and white. But actually, when you think about B Corp as a movement, everything is a calibration about how rigorous you want to set your standards. And if you set them too rigorous, you can't build a community that is large enough and vocal enough to demand change at the highest levels of policymakers. But if you set them too low, you lose credibility. You might have a huge community, but it doesn't have the credibility to then demand change. It's not demonstrating a new model of doing business that is better for the environment and better for people. So that conversation and that calibration is always at front of mind. And that's why we've gone out to do these kind of numerous public consultation rounds to get all stakeholders to feed into where we set that bar. So I think that is fundamentally a challenge that we're up against, but it's a challenge that is incredibly important in basically ascertaining what leadership needs to look like from business going forward against these issues. In terms of B Corps themselves, I ultimately think some B Corps won't be able to meet these new standards, but that shouldn't be because we haven't taken them on the journey. So we're doing a huge amount of work at B Lab UK to think about what are these standards that are coming and how we can work with all B Corps that are currently B Corps and steward them on that journey, because that's the most impactful thing to do, is to take them on that journey from where they are right now to meeting these new standards. We may have B Corps that fundamentally cannot meet these new standards, but I hope that the large majority of companies are engaging with us to all go on that journey from where we are right now to meeting those new standards that are minimum requirements across a number of impact topics.
Yeah, it's great. Good answer. And I think not everyone can be happy all the time. Some people will be disappointed. We've talked a lot in this conversation about not being perfect and, continuously improving. And you've used the word calibration. And I like this sort of ongoing evolution, constantly listening, constantly adapting this approach. I think this is meaningful, and I think you're right where not everything is black and white. I also love the phrase direction, not perfection. And so even if you've come some way to achieving these standards and fallen short, that's still ultimately better for the world than if you had not bothered at all. After a reasonably tough question, which you did well on, let's bring you back to something nice. What are you most proud of professionally, James, when you look at your time at B Lab and the B Corp community?
My answer is probably going to be less about something I've done personally and more about something I'm part of. And broadly, that is the B Corp movement. It is a group of individuals who are committed to changing the role business should play in our lives. Hopefully you'd agree with that, having come to some of our events and engaged with other people across the community. Sometimes, to me, that comes across as the excitement of people who I work with and who are working for B Corps. But sometimes that comes across as challenge as well. We get from those in the community who are deeply engaged with how we steward this movement and how we push for change on a systemic level. We welcome both of those things, that excitement and that challenge. More specifically, I guess, I'm proud to work for B Lab UK and working with colleagues who are extremely passionate about impact and are extremely mission-oriented. We've grown, I spoke about this earlier, we've grown significantly over the 5 years I've been here. But in the organization, it still feels the same. It's the same culture, the same way in which we interact with one another, and the same level of dedication shown by those colleagues as well.
Fantastic. Well, yes, you mentioned me, and I am also very proud to be part of the community and not only attended events, hosting them. Just as at the time of recording, some of you who listen to this podcast will know that I host B Corp speed dating. It's non-romantic. That's the first thing to say. It's a business networking event. And I actually hosted one of these yesterday, and I realised that I've been running these for 4 years. And so I've had hundreds of B Corp connections made, and we now have a point where our CEO goes to events and they see Standing on Giants. They're like, oh, the speed dating.
Have you got any data on whether there have been any romantic connections on the back of that?
I would love it. I'm short on data on actual romantic connections, but certainly business connections. I'm now hearing more and more businesses, getting leads, starting to work together, starting to collaborate, getting new clients, getting new people that they've hired through these events, which is fantastic. And actually, I think this is a good opportunity, James, to plug the big B Corp festival that is coming in September, where actually, you heard it here first, people. I've been asked to run B Corp speed dating in person, which is going to be absolute chaos and fun. But tell us about what that festival is going to be like. It's in September.
Yeah, so as you say, it's in September and it's going to be hosted in Oxford, and we're going to be bringing the community together in probably the biggest event that we've ever done, which is really exciting. And actually, we're talking about it as louder than words. So it's all about action, and actually it's all about what being a B Corp means and what is the kind of mindset, the identity that you need to be a B Corp. And for me, that ultimately means not only working within the borders of your own business and working on your own impact, but also going beyond the borders of your influence. And companies do that by virtue of being B Corps themselves, because they're proving that they're a model that others can follow. But also, if you're in the B Corp community, there's a ton of things that the companies do, whether it's signing up to campaigns, whether it's being part of working groups to change their own industry, that goes beyond the borders of their own organization to inspire others and create change.
Excellent. Yeah. And I think we'll be having quite a lot of fun and quite a few B Corp beers as well. Just as a final footnote. That's my plan.
Thanks.
Anyway.
Yeah, thanks for plugging that. I'm all business, obviously.
You're so focused, James. You're so focused on the calibration of the of the new standards. Bless you. Yeah, we'll have a few toasts in the...
Perfect.
I'm going to need some after I've tried to do in-person speed dating with 200 people. Anyway, let's move on to our final section now. That's a good opportunity when we're talking about impact beyond the borders of our everyday life. We want to take you to a little bit radical world. And what's a change that you would like to see people get behind that maybe you're not impacting on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, I think this is quite theoretical. And actually going back to my university days, a political theorist called John Rawls, it's this idea of what's called the veil of ignorance. So this is essentially about people designing societies from the point of view of not knowing where they would be in that society. So for example, you don't know if you're going to be rich or poor. You don't know what your nationality is going to be. You don't know what your gender is going to be. You don't know what your race is going to be, when trying to think about what is the most just society that we can create. And so while, this is a thought experiment, it takes you out of your own personal circumstances and obviously what's best for you, and forces you to engage with the question of, what if I were homeless? What if I lived in a less developed country? What if I were born a woman? How would I actually want to be treated by society? And actually, that is how we should design a society. And this is helpful, obviously, when going to the ballot box, which for UK listeners, we'll be doing some point this year. It's not going to be May, it may be December even. I don't know. So yeah, whenever you go to the ballot box, but also, if you're thinking about wanting to join a campaign or generally just kind of building out your worldview and how you want to try and bring that about, I think it's actually a really useful thing to kind of have in your head.
We're coming to the end of our conversation now, sadly, but the last question is always the same, which is that if there's someone listening to this that has a little bit of a radical idea for a business or for their personal life, or they too have a thought experiment that they want people to get behind, but they don't know where to start, what would your advice to them be?
Maybe from a business point of view, if they're trying to start up a business, I'm all about work, clearly, because if I want to bring it back to sustainability, I think it's really about kind of baking your values in from the start. And as we talked about earlier, how we were describing what a stakeholder is, if you're trying to build a business beyond just the kind of standard orthodoxy, thinking about your values and thinking about your relationship with your stakeholders is actually going to lead to that business thriving and having prosperity over the long term. But I would also say that for someone starting a business from scratch, they can often think that sustainability or, living their values through that business is actually going to be counterintuitive. Like, it's going to create constraints that will hold in their creativity and their innovation. I actually think those constraints, like, don't ruin the environment, don't kind of exploit people, can actually breed creativity, breed kind of radical thinking, breed innovation. So giving a challenge to someone to create a product, for instance, that doesn't have a negative impact on the environment can actually bring out those solutions that go beyond what is the norm or what's the kind of established orthodoxy. That's how we get companies like Elvis and Cressy, who make beautiful handbags and wallets out of old fire hose, saving them from landfill. Like, for me, that's the pinnacle of creativity. Or, as you mentioned previously, Toast Beer, who are making delicious beer from old supermarket bread. And again, that is innovation at its most kind of purest and exciting form.
I think that's a fantastic one. Yeah, I think you're right. There's sort of a fear that living your values and being an ethical business is going to limit your growth, but it is fuel for creativity. And it's also going to mean that you're going to be able to stick at this thing. If you're trying to build a business that's completely misaligned with your values, that's a recipe for a nervous breakdown, frankly, because it's hard to run a business. So you better be aligned with your values and your, personal mission and purpose. I think that's great advice. Lovely, James. Well, thank you so much for talking to us today. It's been great to hear all about B Lab and the change in B Corp standards and your perspective on the world of business. Thank you very much for joining us and hope to speak to you again soon. Thank you for listening to this podcast. If you enjoyed it, please follow us on your podcast platform. If you'd like to appear on A Little Bit Radical or have an idea of someone we should speak to, please email podcast@standingongiants.com. or get in touch with me on LinkedIn. You can search Rob Fawkes or search Standing on Giants and you'll find me there. Thank you very much and speak to you next time.